Public Library, and welcome to the 2015 Michigan Notable Book Program, or at least our part of the program. Michigan Notable Books is designed to promote reading and raise awareness of Michigan literary heritage. Every year, 20 most outstanding books are selected, books that are reflective of our of our state's diverse ethnic, cultural, historical, and literary experience. And this year's selection you may see at the small display on the other side of the entrance. It's a little hidden from here, but we can show you where. The major part of the Michigan Notable Books program is Michigan Notable Authors Tour, and this year we have a pleasure to be a host of one of the most distinguished Michigan authors, whose book, A Polish Doctor in the Nazi Camps, was named a 2015 Michigan Notable Book and also a finalist in the 2015 Forward Review Book of the Year Award. Our guest tonight is an anthropologist with a PhD in anthropology and behavioral science from the University of Kentucky. Her master's degree in cultural anthropology was also from that university, and her Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology was from University of Michigan. And her areas of specializations are so many that I probably should skip this. She has published many articles and book chapters, and her most recent book is A Polish Doctor in the Nazi Camps, My Mother's Memories of Imprisonment, Immigration, and the Life Remade. So let me welcome our special guest tonight, and forgive me this long introduction, so welcome Dr. Barbara Rylko-Bauer.
Thank you very much, Tamara. I appreciate that introduction, and I also appreciate the chance to talk here at the Hamtramck Public Library. See if I can you still hear me if I don't have this right in my face? Good. I grew up in Detroit, but not in Hamtramck, and yet that's of course what everybody asks me. You know, people assume that if you're Polish and you are in Detroit, then it is Hamtramck, but of course Poles and Polish Americans have lived for a long time in various parts of Detroit. And that, I think, is in part evidenced by when you look at the distribution of Polish parishes. And they're throughout the area, the parishes that were established specifically as Polish initially and function as such well into the 20th century, and maybe some of them still do. In fact, I used those parishes as my sampling frame when I did my master's thesis, which I did here in Detroit. In the late 1970s, I was looking at ethnic change and variation in the Polish American community. So, now I want to share with you today a very personal story, because it's, of course, about my mother. It's a Polish story, but it's also an immigrant story, and it's a Detroit story. While my mother was born in Poland and lived there for 33 years, she actually spent a larger part of her life in Michigan. She immigrated here in 1950 to Detroit, and then moved from here in 1984 to Grand Rapids to be closer to family. And that's where she died on December 2nd, 2010, at the age of 100. Now, working on this project has made me realize the importance of stories, rich in experience, emotion, content, and cognition. You know, a single story can reveal, personalize, and humanize both the positive aspects of our existence, our accomplishments, our relationships, our joys, as well as the suffering, injustice, and struggles of daily life in ways that broader history oftentimes cannot. Stories connect us to each other, to our communities, and to our individual and collective pasts. They're an active way of remembering. They're a form of witnessing. Now, my account of this particular story began in April of 2000, as I sat around my dining room table with my 89-year-old mother, looking at a shoebox full of old photographs from the early post-war years in Germany. This seemed like a safe way to enter a traumatic past, especially because she was a reluctant participant initially. She didn't like to dwell on old history, and believe it or not, she didn't think that her story was worth telling. Our interactions went on for a number of years, and the interviews and conversations were all conducted in Polish, which I then translated into English. Now, despite her age, my mother had a remarkable memory. But at the same time, you know, there was a lot that she didn't know, and also many things that she couldn't recall 6 decades later. And so by doing a lot more research and reading other accounts and visiting some of the sites from her past, some of which you'll see in a moment, I was able to both flesh out and corroborate her story, and also to embed it in a broader historical context. So in the book, narrative and memory are interwoven with layers of history. Now, I'd like to begin by reading a vignette from the book that captures the moment when my mother's life changed forever. It had been a busy day. So many patients to see, and I had a lot on my mind. Even though I was exhausted, I couldn't fall asleep. I kept thinking about the events of recent weeks, and every once in a while would turn on the light to glance at my watch. Sometime after midnight, I finally drifted off. In what seemed just a few minutes later, I was abruptly awakened by loud knocking and shouts outside my door. I sat up, heart racing, unable for a moment to move or think. I hurriedly got out of bed, threw on my robe, and rushed to the door. As I reached for the knob, I paused. I had been dreading this moment ever since I found out that Witold, a member of our radio listening group, had been arrested. The Nazis had made it a crime for Poles to own or even to listen to the radio. But we were so hungry for news about the war that we took risks. Over the past few weeks, we had been worrying that Witold would break down under Nazi interrogation and tell everything he knew. How many days would go by before the Gestapo paid each of us a visit? And I had good reason to worry. Since the Germans had occupied my hometown of Łódź in September of 1939, 2 of my sisters had been arrested, and one of them was languishing in a concentration camp. Bracing myself, I opened the door, determined not to show how frightened I was. Several men armed with revolvers brushed aside my protests as they brusquely entered the apartment. One of them, who spoke Polish, ordered me to get dressed quickly. For a moment, anger overcame my fear, and I demanded that he turn away while I dressed. But he refused to let me out of his sight. So I took off my pajamas and put on a slip and dress, stockings, shoes, and then my warm, fur-lined coat, hat, and a pair of gloves. I picked up my purse just as the man grabbed my arm. He hustled me out of the apartment and shoved me into the back seat of a dark car. I sat there, waiting, stunned and shaking. As we drove off, I glanced back once more at the building where I had worked and lived for 3.5 years and hoped to God that I would soon return. My mother never again saw that apartment that the Gestapo took her from in the early hours of January 13th, 1944. And 23 years would go by before she was able to return to her native city, walk its streets, and visit with family and friends who had survived the war. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to introduce you to my mother, Jadwiga Lenatowicz Rylko, although Polish friends and family have always called her Jadzia. This photograph, incidentally, was taken when she had just turned 97, and it was for her parish directory. And this photograph was taken a few years earlier when she was still driving. And I'd like you to notice how petite she looks next to that Dodge Neon. But looks can be deceiving because, as you'll learn, she had a lot of strength and resilience. So, for example, most people get their driver's license when they're teenagers. My mother learned how to drive at the age of 60, after my father died. And she continued driving until 94, so we can add willful to that list of characteristics. Now, Jadzia was born to a Catholic family in the Polish city of Łódź. And I use the Polish pronunciation, but some of you might be familiar with it as Lodz or Lodz, spelled L-O-D-Z. And I only have a few photographs from her, the first 2 decades of her life. And in this one, she's posing in front of a grove of birch trees in the countryside with her 4 sisters. This one is from her high school years, and she's wearing a student's cap. And she was probably, 17 or 18 years old here. During World War I, schooling was interrupted, so she really didn't graduate from what we would now call high school until she was 20 years old. And this is her senior class. She went to a small private school. And I mentioned that my mother had a remarkable memory, and this was a photograph of her. When she showed this to me, she remembered the name of each of these women and could tell me a little bit about their families or, something that happened to them that she remembered still. Now, in the fall of 1930, Jadzia enrolled in medical school at the University of Poznań, which was about 125 miles from her home city, but easily accessible by train. And she remembered many of the courses that she took. It was a 6-year medical curriculum, and a very vigorous one as well. And I have several photographs from that time period I'd like to share with you. This is actually the photograph was taken 2nd year of medical school, and this is part of her medical school record, which I had the good fortune of acquiring when I went to Poznań in 2011. So this covers the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year of medical school, and it has all her courses listed and the hours and the signatures of all her professors. And there's 3 of these booklets, and they're about a passport size. So they're a real treasure. And this is also from the 2nd year, and this is the gross anatomy lab, of course. And I want you to notice that there's quite a few women around that dissecting table. There were 25 women in her class of 150, which is a much better proportion than what you had in any of the medical schools here in the United States, certainly in the 1930s. Now, in December of 1936, Jadzia returned to Łódź to pursue postgraduate training, which included doing a pediatric residency at the renowned Anna Maria Hospital, which was about a 350-bed prestigious children's hospital. And there were a number of women physicians who were on staff, and they served as very important mentors and models as her training progressed. Unfortunately, that training was to be interrupted, for on September 1st, as you all know, I'm sure, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and 17 days later, the Soviet Union attacked from the east in accordance to a secret pact that the 2 nations had signed a month earlier. Within a couple of weeks, the conquest of Poland was complete. And Germany annexed a major portion of Poland's western territories, which included the city of Łódź, that they then renamed Litzmannstadt. In fact, they renamed every single street and square in the city. So the main commercial artery, the very elegant Piotrkowska Street, became Adolf Hitler Strasse. Their plan for Łódź was to have it become a major German city of their conquered eastern territories. And not surprisingly, the persecution of the population began immediately. So you had many prominent citizens, politicians, professors, clergymen arrested and executed within the first couple of months of the occupation. Museums, theaters, and libraries like this were forbidden to Poles, and universities, schools, and churches were closed down. In fact, the church where Jadzia was baptized, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church, eventually became a Nazi warehouse where bedding and goods plundered from Jews were stored before being shipped to Germany. And in this photograph on your right, you can see an old photograph, you can see the bedding piled up against one of the side walls of the church. The other photograph is one that I took last summer, and it shows you what the church looks like now. Now, before the war, Łódź was home to the second largest Jewish population in Poland, 223,000. And they, of course, became the immediate target also of Nazi persecution. In February of 1940, an order was issued that all of the Jewish residents were forced into a very small area, about 1.6 square miles. And any non-Jewish residents of this area were ordered to vacate that neighborhood or those neighborhoods immediately. And it just so happened that my grandparents lived in the midst of what was to become the Łódź ghetto, and so they had to move without much notice. Now, during the 5 years that the ghetto existed, it was a huge slave labor camp. It was a place of tremendous suffering and high mortality because of the terrible living conditions, and it was a point of departure for the Helmno and Auschwitz death camps. And so most of the residents of the ghetto did not survive. They either died within its walls or were gassed. The remaining Polish population, the Christian population, were all required to work largely at menial jobs, those between the ages of 16 and 60. And everybody had to carry identity papers or an identity book. So this is an Arbeitsbuch, which means workbook in German. And if you were caught on the street without the identity papers, that was instant arrest. In addition, thousands of Polish citizens were rounded up, often without warning, and deported to work as forced workers in Germany, where there was a critical labor shortage. In fact, it's estimated that about 1.7 million Polish citizens were deported to Germany during the time of the war. Now, most of these forced workers, they all were paid a very minimal wage. Their movements were restricted, and their living and working conditions ranged from tolerable to horrific, all depending on who you worked for, where you worked, and what kind of work you were required to do. And those from Poland, so there were forced workers from many of the occupied countries, but those from Poland had to wear the letter P on their clothing, a patch like you see from this museum exhibit, to distinguish them from the German population. Now, the Nazis also removed Poles from professional posts, and so in May of 1940, in the midst of the final year of her pediatric residency, Jadzia was dismissed from the hospital and instead was assigned to work as a general practitioner in a small segment of the city. 2 years later, 2 of her sisters were arrested for their involvement in underground resistance activities. And all of you probably know that Poland had the largest and most effective underground resistance movement in all of war-torn Europe. The oldest sister, Marysia, was eventually sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. But Jadzia managed to save the younger sister by bribing an official in the camp where she was being held, and then the sister survived the rest of the war by going into hiding because she had no identity papers after that. Now, Yaja was not above taking risks herself, and every once in a while, she would meet with other friends at a colleague's house where they listened in secret late at night to foreign radio broadcasts, something that was strictly forbidden by the Nazis. And so, in the early hours of January 13th, 1944, Yaja and her friends were each arrested in their homes, and they were sent to the local Gestapo women's prison, which you see in the photograph here on the right. Now, this prison, the conditions in this prison were very difficult. Their food was meek, very, poor, a lot of overcrowding, no medical care, and the women were at constant risk of abuse by either the guards, and also frequent interrogations by the Gestapo. Now, this prison is now a museum, which I discovered when I went looking for the prison in 2005. It is now the Museum of Independence Traditions. And I took this photograph when I returned again in 2011, the other photograph. So that's what the museum looks like now. And during the tour of the exhibits, I was reminded of how my mother described her arrival in the prison in that early morning in January. And so I'm going to quote from her now. She talked about walking down a narrow corridor lined with heavy, dark wooden doors, all barred and locked. Each door had a small screened opening with a sliding cover, through which a guard could look into the cell. The women all lay there on the floor, on straw covered with blankets, lined up like herring in a tin can. There was also a platform of wooden boards, and this is where I spent that first night. Now, this is an exhibit, but it's an exhibit of an actual cell, and it may very well be the cell in which my mother spent her imprisonment. And if you'll notice, it's 100 square feet, and it held, on the slide it says 10, but in actuality it held up to 13 or 14 women. Now, the exhibit in the museum also demonstrated a variety of ways in which women from all walks of life, most of whom were arrested as political prisoners, the ways in which they supported and sustained each other. So they would sing scouting songs quietly to each other. They would write poems on little scraps of paper and make trinkets and mementos from bits of material and yarn, like you can see in this slide. They even would take bread and form bread into shapes and then let it dry. And this rosary is actually made from dried bread and string. Now, Yaja remained in this prison for 9 long weeks. And then in the early hours of March 16, 1944, she and 78 other women were transported by train under guard, of course, to the large women's concentration camp, Ravensbrück, which is located 55 miles north of Berlin. Now, the site of the former Ravensbrück concentration camp is now a museum and memorial, which I finally had a chance to visit last August. And within the memorial grounds, there stands this imposing and somber statue titled Burdened Woman. And it looks out over a lake to the nearby town of Fürstenberg. This lake, it's Schwedt Lake, is also a graveyard because when women died in Ravensbrück, they would be cremated. They had several crematoria, and their ashes would be dumped into this lake. Now, this is a camp that isn't well known, despite the fact that over 120,000 women and 800 children, as well as 20,000 men. There was a men's camp on the outskirts of Ravensbrück, but it was kind of a part of the camp. But so 120,000 women, 800 children were imprisoned in this camp over its 6-year existence. And these women came from all over occupied Europe, but there was a very high proportion of women from Poland. And over 25,000 of them lost their lives in this camp, including, I found out this past August, at least 3 of Yaja's friends from her radio listening group. And that made me pause a little bit, and think if things didn't evolved the way you will learn in a moment they did, I might not be here speaking with you. Now the morning after, I was also going to just show you one picture from the camp itself. Most of the buildings no longer exist, but the camp entry gate and a big proportion of the camp wall is still standing, as you can see on the photograph that I took, and you can compare it to this older photograph from the early 1940s. Now, the morning after Yaja and her fellow inmates arrived, they were officially registered, and this was a very traumatizing and humiliating experience for all women, because they stripped, they showered, then they were led naked into a large room where they were examined, and many of the women had their heads shaved, including Yaja. They then were issued a prison uniform, which was a gray dress made out of very coarse material with vertical stripes. They got a kerchief, old socks, and wooden clogs, and a number. So Yaja no longer had a name. She was now prisoner number 32,220. And that's how the prisoners were referred to. Now, my mother she spent a relatively short period of time in Ravensbrück, about 6 weeks, but the dehumanization that she endured became seared in her memory. And the passage that I'd like to read to you next, I think really demonstrates that. Because my mother expressed interest in learning what other survivors recalled about their experiences in the camps where she had been, I loaned her a memoir about Ravensbrück, a slim volume written by Geneviève de Gaulle Antonios, niece of General Charles de Gaulle. It's titled The Dawn of Hope. My mother stayed up reading late into the night. When I visited her the following day, she shared her impressions with me. So this is my mother speaking now. This author, she had it much worse than I did. She was locked up in a punishment cell and tortured. At least I was never tortured. Then my mother paused, visibly upset, and her eyes filled with tears. When I was reading this account, the memories flooded back. I said to myself, this is me, the shaved hair, the wooden clogs. I saw it all again right before my eyes. I will never lose this image, these memories. And then, I began to cry. I cried for quite a while. But then I pulled myself together. Enough, I said. Bashu, it took me a long while to fall asleep that night. Now, the violence that Yaja and her fellow prisoners endured, the nakedness, public exams and shaving, rags for clothes, inhumane living conditions, was not only physical violation, but also psychological, emotional, and symbolic assault, aimed at destroying the women's sense of dignity, worth, identity, personhood. The loss of their hair, crudely clipped and shaved, reinforced the message, you are now powerless, sexless, featureless, nameless, no longer a person. Yaja's experiences of what she referred to as poniżenie człowieczeństwa, or the degradation of humanity, meaning not just what she herself went through, but also what she saw all around her, became the standard by which she judged the rest of her concentration camp experiences. But my mother also did a number of things to survive and to try and hold on to that very, very slim thread of human dignity. So once she traded a precious loaf of bread for an even more valuable head of garlic, which has lots of vitamins and minerals and is protective of the gums. And that's one example where being a physician probably, increased the chances of her survival. Another time she traded a loaf of bread for old newspapers, which she stuffed inside her dress to stay warm. And every morning she would get up before everybody else and make her way to the large sinks that were in the washroom of her barracks. And this is how she described what she did. I would strip naked and climb into the sink and wash my whole body under the freezing water using a bit of soap that they gave us. I did this to get hardened, to toughen up, so I wouldn't get sick. Now, sometime in early May of 1944, Yaja was selected, along with 7 other women who just happened to be physicians, to be reassigned from this camp to work as prisoner doctors in Jewish slave labor camps that were part of another concentration camp system called Gross-Rosen. Now, she spent about a month traveling under guard, of course, through several different camps until she reached her final destination, which was in the German city of Neusalz. And this was a camp of about 1,000 Jewish women who worked as slaves for the German textile firm Gruschwitz. And this was a very large factory complex. You can kind of get a sense of that from this old postcard. There were about 80 buildings, and the factory employed about 3,500 workers who made cotton, linen, and hemp thread for German uniforms. They only employed about 1/3 of the local German population, however. The rest were either prisoners of war, foreign forced workers, including many from Poland, and then these Jewish slave laborers. Now, I know what the camp looked like, but not necessarily from my mother's descriptions. I actually have found a German reconnaissance photo that was taken in February 7th, I think it was, in 1945. And this town or city of Neusalz was about 50 miles from Germany's eastern border. And so the Air Force was monitoring the area to see where the Soviet troop movements were. And that's why they were taking these aerial photographs. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the photograph, which I've blown up here, you can see the camp. And that's outlined in a triangle. And the women would walk across the street to the factory entrance. And this is the factory complex right here. And I'm kind of speculating that my the barrack she was in might have been right down here. Now, life was very hard for the Jewish inmates who worked in this factory because their diet was very meager. They were, of course, often abused by the guards. And they had to work for no pay, long hours, oftentimes on very dangerous machinery. But I was also amazed at how creative and ingenious they were. So they would smuggle thread in their underwear. And then they would wind several strands of thread together to make a larger strand, which they would then knit and crochet into sweaters and socks that they would trade, secretly of course, with their German co-workers for more food. And Yaja was herself a recipient of one such sweater. It was red. She said it was the color of beets. And it was made for her by a couple of the Jewish inmates and given as a gift on Christmas Eve. And that's the significance of the red yarn on the card that I passed out. And if somebody's come after I started talking, you can pick up one of those cards afterwards. And I always like to tell this anecdote whenever I speak, because number one, it gives a balance to some of the terrible things that I share with you. But I also think that it gives us a little bit of insight into really what makes us human. You know, my mother's story has taught me many things, but one of them is both the tremendous capacity that we have for evil and brutality and violence as human beings, but also, I would like to think, the even deeper capacity that we have for kindness, for empathy, for generosity, affection, even in the midst of horrible circumstances like a slave labor camp. Now, Yaja lived in a small barrack, which she shared with a Jewish dentist and a young nurse. And and nearby there was a small infirmary with about 20 beds. And the women came largely for work-related problems. So they had, cuts and abscesses, ulcers, respiratory. Textile factories are known for causing respiratory problems because of all the dust, and also stomach ailment. And she was on call much of the time because the women worked different shifts. So she wasn't, really didn't wander around the camp and visiting, women in other barracks. And she never was allowed to leave the camp. So she never set foot in the factory, for example. To get a better sense of what the women's daily lives and their working conditions were like, I turned to other sources, including testimonies by survivors that are now stored or archived in Yad Vashem, which is the major Holocaust center in Israel. So this is one example. An inmate, Anna Katz, recounted in her post-war testimony, "My work was especially difficult and dangerous because I would have to insert the fibers into the machine, and I could easily have lost a hand or finger." Most of the young women had respiratory problems due to all the dust in the factory. But what bothered us, what we suffered the most from, was hunger. I've included this slide to show you how complex the machinery was, and you can see how easily this woman, for example, could get her hands caught in the moving parts. And this is also just an example, because people are interested in, how did you get all the material for your book? And I actually traveled to the town of Neustadt, which now is the Polish city of Nowa Sól, because after the war, due to the different, the agreements between the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, the borders shifted. Poland didn't have a role at all to play in these negotiations, but her borders shifted. And so the German town of Neustadt now is the town of Nowa Sól. And the curator of the museum, the director of the museum there, is very interested in this history. And he has a large collection of photographs taken in the factory during the war. This is not a Jewish inmate. This is a forced worker, perhaps from Poland or the Ukraine. And he kind of judged that from just the way that she was dressed. Now, Yaja oftentimes felt like she was providing largely first aid because she really didn't have the tools of her trade. She just had sutures and bandages, charcoal, aspirin, maybe some antibacterial tablets, but not really much else. And she did, of course, the best that she could. And there was one instance when she actually was able to save a life, when she truly felt like a physician who had made a difference. And a young Hungarian Jewish woman, one of the inmates, came one day complaining of a sore throat, high fever, and trouble swallowing. And she was admitted into the infirmary. And it didn't take Yaja long to realize that she was dealing with a case of diphtheria, a highly infectious and potentially fatal disease. So when the doctor from the factory came to confirm her diagnosis, she insisted that he return with the proper dose of antitoxin serum, which is how diphtheria was treated in the pre-antibiotic days. In the meantime, the woman and her bunkmate were isolated, so the disease wouldn't spread. And Yaja waited, and she worried, because she really didn't know if that doctor would come back, or if the authorities would just decide to kill these women. I mean, after all, Jews were being killed by the millions just for being Jews. But the doctor kept his promise, my mother said. And he treated me like a colleague and not like a prisoner. A few days later, he returned with the right dose of serum. I gave the patient a series of shots, and she recovered. When she left the infirmary, she thanked me and said that she would never forget what I did for her. My mother loved to tell this anecdote repeatedly, and it really did obviously mean a lot to her to be able to have made a difference like that. Now, events took a dramatic turn at the end of January 1945. As the Soviet troops were approaching Germany's eastern border, the order was given for the camp to be liquidated. So one morning, all the women were collected. They were given a knapsack with a blanket and a couple loaves of bread. And then they were marched out under guard for what was to become a 42-day death march through southeastern Germany and the Czech Sudetenland, about 280 miles. And I'm including this map is also in the book, but I'm including it just to give you a sense of the trek, and also to kind of point out that the second part of this march actually went through very hilly, if not even mountainous territory. And actually that's not very visible on this screen, unfortunately, but you can kind of see that in the map that's in the book. Now, not surprisingly, many women did not make their final destination, which was yet another concentration camp, Flossenburg. And Yaja spent another week there, and then she was sent to work yet again as a prisoner doctor for another Jewish slave labor camp called Melteuer. And that's where she remained until the camp was liberated by the U.S. Army on April 15, 1945. Now, the story doesn't end, of course, with liberation and the Allied victory in Europe. And so the third part of my book is titled Surviving Survival. And it talks about the aftermath of such experiences, and also the struggles and uncertainties of life in post-war Germany and as an immigrant to the United States. Now, the image that's on the front of the book was inspired by probably the first photograph taken after liberation. It was taken by the U.S. Army Signal Corps, and this is how big it is. This is just like 1 by 2 inches, and it's very wrinkled. My mother clearly carried it around with her a lot in those first couple of years. And I mentioned to you earlier that she was a reluctant participant initially. You know, the first time I saw this photograph was when I was 50 years old. And I started talking with my mother. And we were talking about, you know, those early years as a refugee. And she says, "Oh, I have something to show you." And she goes and brings back an envelope with several photographs, including this one. Now, a few months after the photograph was taken, she began working as a refugee doctor in several displaced persons camps. And then in the middle of 1946, she was assigned to work in the infirmary of a civilian guard training camp. And this was part of a program, larger program, that in Polish is known as Oddziały Wartownicze, which is civilian guards. And it was a program that was a part of the U.S. military's, the U.S. Army's military labor service. But it was run largely by Poles and also refugees from the Baltic states. And this is where she met my father, Polish Colonel Władysław Rylko. And he was a German prisoner of war for 5.5 years. Now, he spoke English quite well, and so he very quickly got a job as a liaison officer with the U.S. Army. And my parents married in 1947. Now, my father was, you know, as a high-ranking officer in the Army, and also as a vocal critic of the evolving communist government in Poland, he very quickly realized that he could not return. It was too dangerous for him to return back to Poland. He would have been either imprisoned or executed. So once my parents decided to immigrate to the United States, and that was in part because they were working for the U.S. Army, then my mother began to collect documentation of her medical skills. So she, for example, gathered letters of recommendation from her superiors. She volunteered at a clinic at the University of Heidelberg in between jobs. And she also took I'm going to skip up here. She also took a examination that certified her medical qualifications, and this was given by the International Refugee Organization, which was the United Nations agency that was tasked with helping refugees. And this is one of a number of photographs I have of my mother working in Germany. And my father took these photographs, and I also think that that was another way in which you know, they were both trying to document her work as a doctor. Now, I was born in 1950, and then later that year, we boarded a decommissioned U.S. naval ship, and along with 1,290 other refugees, sailed for the United States. We landed in New York on November 14th, 1950, and then the next day arrived in Detroit with $700 and 2 wooden trunks filled with blankets, clothes, and my father's books. Now, my father was he was a career military officer, and so that's not much use, of course, in a new country. So he ended up taking menial jobs and went to night school to get a draftsman's certificate. And then he worked for a number of small engineering firms, seasonally, oftentimes, that contracted with the auto industry. Now, for most immigrants who came here after the war, life was quite difficult in those early years. And they had a lot of adjustment to, you know, a different culture, a different way of life. And my father wrote many letters to his sister and nephew in Poland. And as I was working on the book, I discovered drafts of some of those letters. And I'd like to read you one of them, because I think it really captures aspects of American culture that was probably disorienting for many immigrants. It's also a letter that I think could have just as well been written today. It was written in 1957 when he was 62 years old. What I want more than anything is time. I've been here 6 years and each day get up at 5:30 and go to sleep at 10:30, sometimes later. Even though I struggle to keep my eyes open at work, I can't remember when I last took a nap after supper. This lack of time means that everything is done in a hurry in America. You eat dinner quickly, sleep quickly, make love quickly, and just glance at the headlines. This lack of time makes life here seem superficial, oversimplified, without much depth. Life is difficult, and woe if you get sick, which is why Yaja and I do everything to stay well. Most important, however, is to retain your sense of self and not get lost. America demands youth and strength. My age here is a huge disadvantage. Thus, you can only imagine how hard I work not to be left behind. This takes so much effort. America has everything, and yet most people live in debt. It takes hard work to have even the basics of a good life, meaning food and housing. There's so much more here, but most people have neither the time nor the money to enjoy it. Now, during the first decade in the United States, my mother tried a variety of strategies to gain medical licensure. But like a lot of refugee professionals, both then and now, she faced a lot of barriers. Those IRO certificate and those letters of recommendation that I mentioned, they didn't seem to matter. She had lost everything when she was arrested. And trying to get certified copies of important documents from Poland was very difficult in the 1950s. And the state medical boards also put up a lot of barriers, frequently changing rules, citizenship requirements. But I think perhaps one of the most significant was the fact that there was really very little pragmatic support from either the Polish American community or the medical community. And the latter, the medical community, there was a lot of bias against, people who weren't trained in the United States. In places like New York City, where you did have organizations that were supporting, providing pragmatic support to refugee professionals, the immigrant doctors fared better. So that support was really critical. And then there were personal problems. My father became very ill twice during the early 1950s and had to be hospitalized. And so without health insurance and bills mounting, my mother took what she thought was going to be a temporary position working as a nurse's aide on the pediatric ward at Henry Ford Hospital. Now, she continued her efforts, probably less able to because she was working full-time now, but especially after she became a citizen, then she really renewed her efforts. And I have letters that she wrote and so forth, but to no avail. And so she finally gave up in 1960, and she stayed at Henry Ford Hospital until 1975. My mother never lost her identity as a physician. And she would often tell me as we were talking that the loss of her profession was actually harder for her to bear in the long run than the suffering and imprisonment she endured during the war. Because, medicine was her passion. And it also saved her life in the camps. It was a thread of sanity in an otherwise insane world. But despite these losses, she was able to share her memories with me without any bitterness, rancor, or hatred. And for that, I am really, truly grateful. She also didn't dwell on her losses, and so I want to end with one final quote, and then just a few images of the happier moments of the new life that she created for herself here in the United States and here in Detroit. So this is my mother speaking now. When your father and I decided to immigrate, we closed the book on our past. We vowed not to look back. Whatever the future held, we would live that life. We were beginning a new life. A different life in a new country. So this is a couple of images from the early years. My parents were able to, in some ways, my parents did kind of embody the immigrant dream, the American dream in a sense, because they were able to buy a house on the southwest side, on Chopin Street, no less. And my dad is certainly very proud of his '67 Chevy here, and they were able to send a daughter to college. My mother traveled a lot, and she went to Poland 7 times. 4 of those times on her own. And the last time was in 2001. I accompanied her when she was 90 years old. And she's standing here in front of the surgical pavilion. Chirurgia means surgery in Polish. And this is the hospital where she was doing her residency before the war, had these pavilions, so separate buildings for different kinds of diseases of children. And when she returned in 2001, she was greeted with great fanfare as the oldest living physician to have worked there. And, an article appeared in the paper, and so it was a nice kind of, coming back full circle. She also upheld the Polish traditions and became a very good cook. She did not know how to cook when she came here. But we always had a traditional Christmas Eve dinner, for example. And this was her new career after she retired. She and my son had a very close relationship, and the book, for that reason, is dedicated to him. So that's my mother's story. Thank you. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has any questions, or their own story to share. Yes.
I want to know exactly when was your mother arrested by the Nazis?
When?
Yeah.
She was arrested in January of 1944. And I don't know if you were here when I mentioned why. She was suspected of being involved in resistance activities, and she was listening to foreign radio broadcasts, and you were not, people in Poland were not allowed to either own a radio or to listen to broadcasts. The Nazis wanted to control what information you had. Yeah, yeah. People also often will ask, so did all her sisters survive? And yes, they did. The one sister who was sent to Auschwitz. She actually both survived both Auschwitz and another terrible camp, Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank died. And my grandparents moved into the countryside. They had a little summer home there. And I think that also was very helpful because in the countryside it was less dangerous. You know, you didn't have police and Gestapo wandering around every corner. And as long as you, I think, kind of laid low, it was safer. You were starting to raise your hand.
Yeah,
Yes.
you said you first started to really talk about this with her in 2000.
2000.
Yeah.
Mhm.
When you were growing up, did your parents talk about this stuff at all to you guys, or was it never spoken of?
Well, I knew kind of the general outline. I mean, I knew my mother was in a concentration camp. I knew my father was a prisoner of war. When they would get together with, their social group was the new immigrants who came over after the war. And so they would get together for Sunday dinners, at each other's homes. And there would be discussions, but they didn't really dwell on, there would be anecdotes that they would share. But they weren't really terrible things. And so I really didn't know a lot of the details. And it wasn't, I had friends and colleagues who, knew just a little bit and kept telling me, you've got to get this story down. You've got to get this story down. And then finally, actually, it was in 2000, my former professor, who I really admire, we were having drinks in San Francisco at a meeting. And he said, so, have you started talking to your mother? And I said, no. And he said, she's going to be dead before you even think about it. I came home, and about 3 weeks later, I got started. So.
Did you grow up in St. Hedwig's?
You may hear?
Yeah.
No. We went to St. Cunegunda's, which is, on the near Livernois. I mean, it was that Livernois, Warren, Michigan area. That's where I grew up. And then I got married at Our Lady Queen of Heaven. 7 Mile and Van Dyke was my neighborhood. Yeah. Well, I think it's time for a refresher. Oh, yes, one more question.
Are your parents buried in here?
Yes, my parents are buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery near 6 Mile and Van Dyke. Yeah. So I do come to Detroit. I love Detroit. I think, a bit of my heart is in this city. And, when I go through Detroit, it's hard to not drive through Detroit and almost want to cry in some places. But I also really believe that Detroit, you can't get the city down. I also think it's a big sin on our country's conscience to have allowed what has happened to Detroit. And there's a whole bunch of social and political economic reasons why, Detroit is where it is. It's a complicated history. But I think people of Detroit are strong. And I think this city has a future.
So again, thank you so much, and if you want, we may continue less formally, and please, we still have refreshments, so we can continue, and thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. And I do have some books here. I mean, you can get books also on Amazon, but I did bring some books in case somebody would like to have a copy
The
signed.
Polish Art Center will have them.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming.